The next significant point is the Section 5. When we talk about the citizens, all citizens of Fiji shall be known as Fijians. There seems to be some doubt about that. Unfortunately, given our history, many countries do not have that, but it is a given. If you're from Australia, you're an Australian. If you talk about the economy of Australia, you say the Australian economy. I was present at the Talanoa session that we had on Thursday, where we had various members from the private sector, NGOs, civil society, giving their views on what they believe should be included in the budget or what should be omitted, how it can be more responsive to the public's needs. And I find it very interesting that one person was talking about the Australian economy, and then in the next breath, when they were talking about the Fijian economy, they said, the Australian economy is XYZ, and the Fiji economy is XYZ. Because there's this fear of saying the Fijian economy. I mean, I think we need to think about these things. We're quite happy to say a Fiji man died in a hotel in New Zealand, but we'll never say an Australia man died in a hotel in New Zealand. We'll say an Australian man dies. This is very simple semantics, but it's critically important. Of course, the current laws include now multiple citizenship. You can hold multiple citizenship. There are many Fijians, of course, who have migrated and want to retain the Fijian citizenship in the same way that others have become Fijians, and they want to hold the citizenships of countries that they came from. It is a globalized world, and that's a recognition of that. I think the next important point is Chapter 2, which is the Bill of Rights. I don't want to bore you with all the details, but suffice to say that all rights obviously have limitations. Most rights, I should say, have limitations. And that's been included in that's set out in Chapter 4. But what is more important for you is to know that the rights, the application of rights now applies to the private sector also. So previously, what we call in legal speak, the vertical and horizontal application of rights. So you yourself in the private sector need to ensure that you, for example, do not discriminate against people. We've got, if you turn to Section 26, where you have the unfair discrimination provisions. Unfair discrimination provisions you cannot, for example, discriminate. A person must not be unfairly discriminated against directly or indirectly on the grounds of his or her, and you've got a list of areas where you cannot discriminate against a person. Previously, it was held to be only applicable in the public sector or in government services. But now it also applies to the private sector, so it's important for you to know that. Now, we have included a number of grounds that did not exist previously in the 1997 Constitution. We have, for example, included culture. We've now included pregnancy, marital status. So as an employer or somebody who's working for an employer in terms of HR, you cannot discriminate against people on any of those grounds, unfairly. What is also, for example, interesting, if you look at subsection 5, this may affect some men. There are certain, I think there's one club I think it's called in Suva, that restricts women from going to one part of the bar. That no longer can be the case, because it applies to access, membership, admission without discrimination to hotels, pubs, and what have you. So it's very groundbreaking. If you're a member of the club or official, you need to take note of that. There are, of course, certain exceptions, and let me tell you, subsection 9, it says that a law or an administrative action taken under law is not inconsistent with the rights mentioned in the section on the ground that it, and you've got various grounds. The one that is perhaps a lot more talked about in Fijian circles makes provision with respect to adoption, marriage, devolution of property on death, and pension. So, for example, we have a provision that says you cannot unfairly discriminate against anybody on the basis of their sexual orientation. So if you're a homosexual, it does not mean that you can get married, because the law of marriage prevails over those unfair discriminatory provisions. In the same way, you have certain instances where it excludes persons from holding certain public offices. So for example, if you're a member of parliament, you cannot go and hold a public office. If we do not have that exception, a member of parliament can go along and perhaps argue and say, this is my right, you're discriminating against me because of my status. So you have to have those exceptions. Just for those people who may have been hearing the politicians talk about, we believe in the people's draft, which is the Yash Gai draft. Yash Gai draft did not have an exception to sexual orientation, so it would have technically allowed for gay marriages in Fiji. I wonder what the other politicians have to say about that. But the issue that we've got listed there on G, which is very important, there is also a recognition that there are certain customary practices in Fiji that need to be given effect to. So to the extent necessary, and we've applied the UN test of necessity, and without infringing the rights of freedom set out in any other sections of this chapter, gives effect to the communal ownership of Itauke, Rotuman and Barnaban land and access to marine resources, or the bestowing of Itauke, Rotuman and Barnaban chiefly title or rank. Let me give you a practical example. If, for example, in a particular area or province, a person becomes chief through a hereditary system or through lineage, a person from that Matangali cannot come along and say, you are discriminating against me because I want to have the right to become a chief too. So it's a recognition of the customary practices that do exist. In the same way, there may be certain practices regarding, for example, marine resources. There are certain villages who may allow, for example, for a few months for no fishing to take place because somebody has passed away. The next villages cannot come along and say, we want to have access to these fishing rights. There's a recognition of that. And that was important to put into place to give effect to the recognition of the customary practices. Wherever it is necessary, certain exceptions or laws will be put in place to give effect to that.